Some episodes of SpongeBob are awful. Between way too much gross-out humor and brain-dead writing, the show sometimes makes me wonder who would have even greenlit some of these episodes to begin with. Make no mistake, I freaking love SpongeBob. But come on, we all know that not every episode is a winner. Today, because I love torturing myself, we're diving deep into the worst episodes of each SpongeBob season to see how much rougher and progressively unhinged the show gets over time. Season 1 luckily doesn't have that many bad episodes. It's more like these little odd moments sprinkled throughout where the writers were still finding their groove. But even with the bucket loads of charm, there are a couple weak entries that are borderline terrible. And before I declare the worst offender, let's throw out two dishonorable mentions. The Chaperone is my first one. It's that awkward one where SpongeBob takes Pearl out to the prom and she keeps crying and being annoying. And the next is Nature Pants. It's a weirdly uncomfortable episode where Patrick has the most unhinged breakdown of the whole series. Okay, with these two duds acknowledged, I formally present the worst Season 1 episode, Squeaky Frickin' Boots. This episode is physically annoying to watch. It's classic SpongeBob, so yeah, there's some meme-worthy content and a few jokes that land, but oh my gosh, man, the whole episode is just this. I mean, usually SpongeBob annoys Squidward, Mr. Krabs, or literally anyone else within a mile radius of him, but this time the writers had an ingenious idea. Flip the script and have SpongeBob annoy the audience. I don't know what they are thinking. Also, fun fact, this actually was the third episode of SpongeBob ever produced, yet Nickelodeon booted it back to air as the 16th episode. No reason was ever given, but let's be real, the episode was probably infamous from the get-go. That all said, I must admit it was pretty funny seeing Mr. Krabs trip out before straight up eating the boots, and it's not even close to being the worst episode in the series, but for season 1, yeah, it takes the spot in my opinion. Moving on to season 2, we see a shift in the animation art style, and though the highs are higher with the season, I felt the lows were lower, and the two dishonorable mentions here gotta be Grandma's Kisses and I'm with Stupid. Grandma's Kisses spent too much time on SpongeBob crying and acting like a child, which I found pretty hard to watch. You know, I expect a manly, chest-hair, giga-chad SpongeBob, not a whiny baby SpongeBob, so wasn't doing it for me. And my beef with I'm with Stupid is it's just too mean-spirited. I didn't enjoy it. But the worst episode season 2 has to offer has gotta be Dumped, since it's just a soggy bowl of depressing B-plot. In this episode, Gary breaks up with SpongeBob before they eventually reunite in the end. This episode combines the two aforementioned cardinal sins of bad SpongeBob episodes: too much crying and a mean-spirited tone. Plus, everyone's had some sort of breakup before, whether friendly or romantic, so watching SpongeBob go through one just kinda brings me down. It shows how the real world can crush even the most optimistic mindset, which goes against SpongeBob's usual message of unyielding positivity. SpongeBob episodes usually celebrate optimism, so seeing this one destroy it felt out of place. It was a generic sitcom subplot that didn't mesh well with the rest of the show's usual tone, so for this reason, Dumped, while a bit unique, packed in all the worst components of SpongeBob episodes all while sending a negative message. But of course, Larry and Jerry are funny gags, but overall, this wasn't the best episode in the season to me. While seasons 1 and 2 each had two dishonorable mentions, for season 3, I can only really pick one because the rest is just too solid in my opinion. The singular dishonorable mention goes to The Sponge Who Could Fly, aka the Lost episode. Now, this episode had some funny moments, particularly with Patchy, and I find I like this episode a lot, but the issue is the pacing. This episode has double the time but half the jokes. Therefore, it felt drawn out and empty, but still not a bad episode overall, so I enjoy rewatching it. But the worst episode, Krabby Land, I can't say the same for. I don't like Krabby Land. Never have, never will. I got a brother that loves this episode and I just don't get it. It's slow, a bit hostile, and only has a couple jokes that actually land. Mr. Krabs is my overall favorite character in the show, and his on-screen presence is pretty good here, but the fact that the entire second half of this episode is just SpongeBob mangling himself is boring to me. And yeah, I get that slapstick is a part of the show's DNA, but when it's just pain for pain's sake, it gets old really fast. I think SpongeBob as a series shines much brighter when it's not just about slapstick and is more about witty situational humor, and Krabby Land isn't really that, so let's move on to season 4. All That Glitters, Gift of Gum, Rule of Dumb. These are some of the worst episodes, not just in season 4, but SpongeBob in general. My pick between the three goes to All That Glitters since it has no real redeeming qualities. All That Glitters is a miserable episode to sit through. Season 4 is fun overall, but man, we have plummeted all the way from the height of Krusty Towers and just face planted onto the pavement with this one. SpongeBob spends the first half of this episode crying, and the second half crying and naked. After his original spatula snaps in half while flipping a monster Krabby Patty, SpongeBob freaks out since it lands spat the spatula in the ER indefinitely, so he replaces him with a French spatula that looks fancy but ends up being a jerk. They did this weird thing where they acted like SpongeBob was cheating on his old spatula with this new one, as though he had left the old one while it was terminally ill in the hospital and went back to it upon being abandoned by the French spatula. They even doubled down and had SpongeBob break down over the infidelity and beg for forgiveness over, quote, the moment of weakness, and that he felt pressure to seek the comfort of a newer spatula model.
What?
Yeah, seriously. What is all this soap opera drama doing in a kids show anyway? I mean, I gotta give them points for creativity with the soap opera parody, but in practice, having 9 of the 11 minutes being spent crying makes the episode painful to watch. And also, I didn't really get the jokes as a kid, cause other than SpongeBob, I mainly just watched WWE. The episode needed more jokes. They went too far with the drama angle and it made the episode unfunny. For that reason, I consider All That Glitters to be the worst episode of Season 4. Season 5. Oh boy. The batting average for these episodes start taking a hard fall in this season. Dishonorable mentions are more plentiful and include Band in Bikini Bottom, Fungus Among Us, and To Save a Squirrel, among other options. My pick for the worst goes to Love a Patty, though. This is that creepy episode where SpongeBob falls in love with a Krabby Patty that he deems perfect. They start dating despite social judgment. SpongeBob kills a bunch of clam younglings, and then Mr. Krabs expresses concern for SpongeBob and convinces him to move on. This episode has some parallels with Season 4's worst episode, since it involves SpongeBob being romantically involved with inanimate objects in the Krusty Krab, but dialed up the disturbing factor to 700. I mean, he literally sings about how the patty's buns are sweeter than honey, and then later on kills around 24 clams to save the Krabby Patty. This episode is freaking wild. It felt out of character and made him come off as very unhinged. Later, when Squidward showed the patty was rotten to the point of maggots primarily making up the meat, it was super gross seeing SpongeBob eat the Krabby Patty anyways out of love to put it down. Yeah, these episodes have diverted far from, oh my gosh, what an annoying all too prevalent squeaking sound, to SpongeBob is legit trying to bone a Krabby Patty. Super degenerate stuff. This episode forced me to add a new entry to the SpongeBob Cardinal Sin list. No weird romantic stuff with the kitchen goods. I can't even believe I had to do that. At this pace, the worst Season 6 episode is gonna have to be some off-the-wall thing like SpongeBob smokes 2 kilos of kelp and gets arrested for stalking his ex. Stay strong, friends. Season 6 is a divisive season. I enjoyed it a lot, and episodes like House Fancy and Spongicus I consider to be certified classics. But I have to acknowledge that this season has boatloads of mid-episodes and some straight nightmare fuel as well. A quick dishonorable mention for Season 6 is The Splinter. I mean, who doesn't love looking at close-ups of infected and swollen fingers? I think this episode is probably the most famous bad episode, not just for the season, but probably the whole series. But I find my pick for the overall worst to be Grooming Gary. And no, not that kind of grooming. It's an innocent episode about a pet show from hell. This whole episode sucks since it falls into that weird middle era trend of let's make Gary suffer episodes. I don't like this type of episode at all, and I don't think anyone else does either. I don't understand why they even bother making them. The whole episode just uncomfortably follows SpongeBob forcing Gary to do a pet show where all the pets are mistreated by their owners. In the end, the pets rebel, and SpongeBob realizes it's wrong to degrade the pets in such a way. The episode is painfully unfunny, and I think the idea behind the writing may have been more about sending a message since it parodied real-life child pageants and pet shows and such, but it definitely wasn't entertaining to see Gary mistreated for so long, and the context of a SpongeBob episode is better suited for comedy. Also, even though the end of the episode undid everything and let Gary get some revenge, I can't even claim to like it since it spawned an idea that was recycled later on for a terrible Season 13 episode called Pat the Dog.
Foreshadowing.
Fitting that the most disturbing episode of the season is the one with grooming in the title. Go figure. Moving on to Season 7. For my choice on Season 7, I'll give you a key hint on which I chose. Disturbing character models. Lots of dishonorable mentions from this season here commit this cardinal sin, which I'm now adding to the list. The Curse of the Hex, Squidward and Clarinetland, Welk Attack. These are all gross and feature horrible character models, but they each at least give you some breaks throughout, you know? Brief little moments where your eyes aren't screaming for mercy. The worst episode of Season 7, though, Trench Billies, does not give you any such break. These characters are all gross and really weird. They all have blind, protruding eyeballs and have faces just begging to be unanimated. I don't know who would actually like this episode, and yet some writer had to have sat down, wrote this, and thought, yes, this, peak entertainment. The whole thing felt like a desperate attempt at making the show feel new and different. It's like one day the writers said to each other, I say, let's throw up some negative cliches about the American South. Great idea! Also, let's animate it with literal vomit instead of ink. Trench Billy's was just lazy since all it did was force constant gross out humor. And it's a shame too. Season 1's Texas is proof that cultural humor can be hilarious when done with wit and respect. It pokes fun at Texas, sure, but in a way that feels clever and affectionate. Meanwhile, Trench Billy just throws out lazy stereotypes, cranks up the gross factor, and calls it a day. It expands the SpongeBob universe, yes, but in all the worst ways. Ugly, boring, pointless. Moving on to Season 8. Dishonorable mentions for Season 8 include Pet Sitter Pat and A SquarePants Family Vacation. Those episodes stunk, but they weren't indicative of what was to come in later SpongeBob seasons. No. Season 8's worst episode was a bad omen of the lazy direction SpongeBob as a whole series was going to start going in. Face freeze. This is an episode that forces me once again to add a new entry to our list of cardinal sins. Spamming exaggerated animation. If lazy slapstick were a Pokemon, this would be its evolution. I think Season 8 is criminally underrated for sure, but one thing I'll never forgive it for is ushering in the new era of funny face equals good show that slowly began to come. This entire episode is just funny faces. It's too lowbrow even for frickin' Peppa Pig. I'll give you a plot summary. Mr. Krabs warned SpongeBob and Patrick not to make funny faces, right? They end up making funny faces the entirety of the episode, and other characters join in, and the episode ends with... Okay, hold up. Real fast, quick spoiler alert. I'm about to describe the masterfully crafted end plot for Face Freeze, so you may want to skip ahead 24 seconds or so if you don't want it spoiled for you, okay? Thanks. Everyone skipped? Great. The episode subverts expectations by ending with everyone's face freezing. I know, right? Crazy. The episode where the whole episode did nothing at all but show funny faces ended with showing more funny faces. I guess this isn't the worst episode on our list so far, but for being an absolute snooze fest and a major step in the wrong direction, it certainly earns the crown for the worst episode in the otherwise generally solid Season 8. Moving on to Season 9. Season 9, the biggest transition season since Season 4. This season really led the transition from middle era to modern era SpongeBob with a new screen size, higher animation budget, and a different approach to the writing. Despite all the praise it's received though, it still spawned a couple forsaken episodes that need to be shotgunned out back. Squid Baby is one such episode that gets a dishonorable mention, and of course, probably the second most infamous SpongeBob episode right behind The Splinter, Little Yellow Book gets the second dishonorable mention. But ladies and germs, neither of these episodes quite demolished debauchery more than Season 9's first episode, Extreme Spots. Remember how I was rambling about how annoying Face Freeze was for having too much exaggerated animation?
If lazy slapstick were a Pokemon, this would be its evolution.
Well, this episode does that too. It introduces us to some same-o, lame-o characters that do nothing but Daredevil stunts the whole time. This is sort of like that Livin' Like Larry episode, but done in a boring style. If these new characters had an engaging goal beyond mindless stunts, or even a shred of charm, the episode could have been salvageable. But as it stands though, there's not much going on plot-wise in the episode, and the action that does occur is significantly less interesting than, say, Season 6's Sandcastles in the Sand. This one was a nothing burger that should have never been served. For Season 10, let's go ahead and get our dishonorable mention out of the way, Whirly Brains. Wasn't a fan and found it obnoxious. But I want to focus more on the worst episode of Season 10 because it stands out immediately to me. The worst episode of Season 10 is hands down Mimic Madness. Just kidding. Mimic Madness is a classic. Housewarming, on the other hand, is the worst episode of Season 10. Even though this is definitely the weakest of the bunch, it still isn't really that bad. It's more like it's just outdone by most other episodes in the season, if you know what I mean. I appreciate that Season 10 trimmed down the fat a bit and earned itself the title of shortest season in the series. But even so, it's kind of unfortunate that a few episodes still felt forced and uninspired. Housewarming is all about a little worm that desperately wants to get inside of SpongeBob. SpongeBob is cool with it at first, and he even lets the worm invite a bunch of friends that throw a party inside of him, much to the annoyance of everyone surrounding him. By the end of the episode, SpongeBob goes crazy off the deep end, commits to being an apartment building, and then maniacally laughs so intensely that it unintentionally scares off all the worms. Yeah, this was a weird one, but what makes this episode even weaker is how oddly specific, yet overdone its premise is, ironically. Plankton's first episode involved him going inside SpongeBob, and then you had that one episode where a worm went inside SpongeBob and kept playing an annoying song in Season 7, plus several other instances where this type of thing occurred over the course of the show, so it really begs the question, why did they rehash it again? It wasn't actively painful to watch or anything, it just made me feel nothing 89% of the time. Despite coming out in a season aiming to be all killer, no filler, housewarming was just painfully forgettable. Season 11's worst episode makes me feel almost violated watching it. Ink Lemonade. The episode involves Patrick jump scaring Squidward as much as possible to get him to squirt ink as a reflex. Patrick then sells this ink to the Bikini Bottomites as lemonade to drink. Like, geez, what the heck? This episode commits multiple cardinal sins. It's mean-spirited, leans heavily on gross-out humor, and spams exaggerated facial expressions way too much. The episode lacked wittiness, and seeing the abuse put towards Squidward caused me to feel more sorry for Squidward rather than amused. I mean, he was a little grouchy at the start of the episode, I guess, but it never felt like he deserved what came to him, so it just made Patrick feel highly unlikable. I think the reason this episode is more famous than most other Squidward torture porn videos is that it made him feel more violated on a personal level, making the whole thing just more unpleasant to watch. Like, one of those things you instinctively just want to look away from. Ink Lemonade is definitely Season 11's worst episode, and if you're curious about my dishonorable mentions, I'd say my leg earns one for reasons I laid out earlier, and Pat Nocchio gets one too for being forgettable. Moving on to Season 12. Season 12 is often widely considered to be the worst overall season in the entire series, so it's no surprise that many of the episodes here aren't received very well. The two most dishonorable mentions go to SpongeBob's Bad Habit and Jolly Lodgers, and my pick for worst overall episode goes to The Nitwitting. This episode is garbage. What an absolute dumpster fire of an episode. Now, I'll give this episode credit for one thing and one thing only. Critics and fans alike have complained for a long time that SpongeBob has gotten dumber over the years. Too dumb, in fact. So in a way, this episode did try to shake things up by shifting how smart it is, if that makes sense. Interestingly, the way they did it was by offering a deep social critique regarding the self-defeating nature of neo-nihilism through a medium parodying a modern Eurocentric, post-agrarian, anarchistic society. Nope, it did the exact opposite actually. Its entire gimmick is that the already stupid Patrick and SpongeBob removed their brains for the sake of being even more stupid to fit in with a bunch of other brainless people. So they changed how smart the show is, sure, but way in the opposite direction. SpongeBob, Patrick, and the other idiots storm the town and destroy everything they can. And then in the final 30 seconds, Sandy Ex Machina shows up and just magically fixes everything. And that's it. That's the whole episode. It's so uninspired. Nobody wants to hear the Ballad of the Idiots or whatever, and being dumb for dumb's sake just doesn't get anyone laughing. This episode talks down to its audience and has no creativity whatsoever. The Nitwitting is hands down the most painfully bad episode in Season 12. Let's move on to Season 13. Real quick, Season 13's dishonorable mentions go to Slappy Days and Lockdown for Love. Yep. The episode that gets the honorable title of worst episode in all of Season 13 goes to the uber annoying Pat the Dog. This episode follows Patrick, who inexplicably just acts as a dog the entirety of the episode, causing chaos. SpongeBob tries to tame him, but continually fails, and Squidward also tries to tame him, but then also continually fails. I mean, if you're a huge fan of Modern Patrick, you'll probably love this episode, but if you're like me and you find Modern Patrick annoying, this episode will be a test of your patience as you actively just want to drop kick your color TV. I have to admit though, there's one prison joke that genuinely made me burst out laughing. At the very end of the episode, this buff, tatted up worm is dropped off at Squidward's house to be tamed, but instead he ends up taming Squidward and takes him out for a walk. Definitely got me rolling. Overall, this episode is better than most other worst episodes, even though it's definitely not great. Let's just see what Season 14 has to offer. We finally reached it! The last completely released season of SpongeBob, Season 14. We've suffered through many a bad episode together, and to start our final entry, let's give a quick dishonorable mention to Buff for Puff. Not a great episode, but not as bad as friggin' In the Mood to Feud. Man, this episode is obnoxious. It's another one of those Trench Billy style episodes where it just says, "Behold, the South." That said, I think it's a step up from Trench Billy's for a few obvious reasons. One, it leans significantly less on gross out humor, even though it still does a decent bit. Two, it brings back the iconic Plankton family, and they've thankfully kept much of their charm over the years, it seems. And three, unlike Trench Billy's, which just meandered around, this episode actually has a clear structure. Initial meetup, fight, post-fight, simple and logical. That said, all too unimpactful. Classic SpongeBob had a way of making nearly every episode quotable or memorable, but this is not even slightly like that. I've seen In the Mood to Feud a couple times now and still struggle to recall any of the lines that they say in it. Those clever, relatable moments from early SpongeBob that just kind of stick in the back of your mind and then pop up randomly are nowhere to be found here. It just goes to show that when all the focus goes towards slapstick, it leaves no space for witty humor and memorable storytelling. So at the end of the day, In the Mood to Feud doesn't just fail, it fails in the worst way possible by being completely forgettable. But yeah, 14 seasons, 14 bad episodes. Let's rank them from least bad to most bad to see which episode earns the spot as the absolute worst SpongeBob episode of all time. The least rotten apple award has gotta go to Squeaky Boots. Next up, for number 13, we have To Love a Patty. This one may be controversial, saying it's not that bad, but the reason I say this is because it's interesting to me. It's one of those episodes that's so disturbing and weird that everyone should see it at least once. Pat the Dog comes in at number 12. It had a certain charm to it and a great closing joke. The worst of the season, but really not terrible. Dumped is next on the list. It has that early SpongeBob charm, doing all the heavy lifting since the jokes aren't that plentiful. Even though a couple gags land well, this episode is legitimately not worth a rewatch. Season 10's Housewarming appropriately places number 10 due to being kind of boring, but still mildly entertaining. And Extreme Spots finds its spot in the middle of the list as a bad, but overall inoffensive episode. Krabby Land from Season 3 places number 8. Despite so much of Season 3 being great, I've never liked this episode and find it too uneventful and mean-spirited. Face Freeze places in at number 7 due to its impressive mediocrity and potential long-term impact on the series. This almost feels like a dividing point in the series, as though this episode announced a style shift. In the Mood to Feud is a boring episode that shouldn't exist. As mentioned in its critique, it's unmemorable, so it places here. Moving on to the first in our top 5, All the Glitters from Season 4 takes the cake for being beyond disturbing. Unlike To Love a Patty, it's not disturbing in an interesting way per se, it's just all around unpleasant to watch. For number 4, the infamous Ink Lemonade episode of Season 11 was memorably unnerving. It's a Squidward torture episode that felt rough on way too personal of a level. Trench Billies takes the number 3 spot and is probably the first episode mentioned so far that I straight up hate. It's constant gross out, overly reliant on stereotypes, and painfully unimpactful in its universe expansion. Grooming Gary scoots right into the number 2 spot because while it's terrible seeing Squidward torture episodes, he's at least a jerk a lot of the time and somewhat able to defend himself, right? Gary, by contrast, is small and vulnerable, so the entire episode having Gary be hurt or forced to do things he doesn't want to do isn't good TV for anybody. My only rationale of how this episode even exists is the theory that it was meant as a message revolving around child pageants and pet shows. But as I said before, I don't believe SpongeBob is the right medium to be sending messages through. It's meant for comedy, right? For those of you with an impressive memory, you already know what episode I consider the worst of all. And unsurprisingly, it's from the absolutely universally loved and adored Season 12's The Nitwitting. This episode sucks! Modern SpongeBob is already divisive enough, but episodes like this are what put people off from it altogether. For every Squidnor or Mimic Madness in the new seasons, you get these baby episodes that don't even need to exist. Witty dialogue, brief but fun storytelling, and charming characters are the jellyfish jelly of a good SpongeBob episode. Few fans want the show to slow down and become more babyish. People want something more interesting. Darker stuff sprinkled in like Wiener Takes All or The Nasty Patty. Clever stuff like Frankendoodle or Chocolate with Nuts. The Nitwitting, to me, has so many of the qualities that made modern SpongeBob put so many people off. And it's not like it's Naruto or something where people will just look up which episodes to skip or watch. People kind of just watch them at random, and if a season keeps spitting duds, they stop watching altogether. I know I've almost definitely said some stuff people are gonna heavily disagree with, and probably also some stuff people are gonna nod their head in agreement to, but it's all my genuine opinion, and I'm super curious what you guys think and how your lists look, or where our takes differ. Now, before you click off, genuinely thanks a million for watching, and drop a like if you feel this video deserves it. And if you stuck around this long, check out this video here about the best episodes of each season. It's a bit more positive, you know? Bye-bye.